if you actually have a task like you want to break SHA with Grover, you need to implement this dynamical infrastructure on the quantum computer. For all I know, this is completely impractical. Your Grover, what will do, will just not completely break stuff. So it's not even changing the exponential time of the known algorithms to polynomial time. It's just cutting the exponent by half or by third or by something like this. I would not put too much money on the prediction that in 20 years' time we are going to really see high-scale quantum computers. But I might be at the same time completely wrong, because maybe in like 5 years' time, someone will make that's like if you think about the development of classical computers from the 50s to this kind of devices that we have, there was a steady pace of progress, like actually exponential. That's the famous Moore's law. But every single period in which this exponential happened was actually caused by a completely different type of engineering miracle, right? And we are now at the level with these quantum computers, I think around 1950s. That's not an exaggeration, that we are like on the very early days of the infrastructure. What is remarkable is that in the 50s, people didn't have that many algorithms built for classical computers, so it was not something that was widely adopted. And here we have, I would say, quite the opposite situation. We have a lot of theoretical algorithms that could be in principle implemented on quantum computers, and they will work. But something that we actually don't know yet is there any algorithm on the quantum computer that would be somehow like practically useful for any kind of purpose and provably faster, like by complexity class, like here polynomial, and then on classical computers something exponential.
Hi Bartosz, thanks for accepting to have this interview.
Thank you, nice to meet you.
So could you introduce yourself and about your background?
Well, I'm a mathematician. By training, I'm actually doing mostly algebraic geometry, number theory. I'm also teaching students courses related to cryptography, classical ones, the ones we can see here. Also very modern one like post-quantum cryptography. I'm also working on the boundary between artificial intelligence and mathematics. I think that's it, probably.
Most of our audience are Bitcoin interested people. So we are mainly interested in Bitcoin as a store of value, but this interest has sparked interest in other areas such as cryptography. For someone who has a very rudimentary understanding, very basic understanding of cryptography, how would you define SHA algorithms? What are they used for?
Well, I think SHA is a particular example of a function of an algorithm which has the following purpose. So if you prepare a document, I think this is probably the best context to talk about this. And this document is, you want to validate it in a sense, or like compare, someone made a little change in the document, and it's usually quite difficult to somehow follow the changes because they might be very small and might be just not practical to follow the changes. So the algorithm like SHA is basically done in the following way, that you can somehow intertwine the information from the whole document and squeeze it somehow, so like make some kind of compression, so that the whole representation of the document is just encoded in a single bit in a single string of bits, which is usually represented just by binary number. And the whole purpose is that you want to make this function in such a way that it's extremely difficult for someone who has no access to the original document to somehow go back from this short representation back to the document. So it's very difficult to somehow undo the function. There's another condition which we want to happen, is that essentially that for every document there is just a unique string of bits attached, so that there is no collision. And what else? Well, of course, we want to have a function that is actually really practical, so that the implementation is efficient and you can actually run it on multiple different devices so that you don't need any fancy supercomputers for doing this. So it should be very practical. I think, yeah, that's mostly what we expect from these functions. So SHA, or the class of SHA algorithms, is it's a very particular, very special, but also very famous and very widely adopted version of such one-way. We call it one-way functions. And what else I want to add? So if you actually look, well, we probably don't want to go through all the steps of the algorithm, but even if you go to Wikipedia and you just look at how this algorithm is organized, you can see that the all of the steps in the algorithm are just basically super elementary operations like shift, bit shift, or XOR addition, or just some maybe register lookup, something like this. And also there is one more condition which is actually quite important, is that if you actually make a change to the document, you want to be sure that the output of this function is going to be widely different from the original one, so that it's not very easy to somehow come up with almost identical shortcut of this whole document. I think this is probably in summary what SHA, like in general, or like what the class of functions like SHA actually is.
So if you change one character, the whole thing will change unrecognizably.
Well,
That's
this is something in cryptography which is also found in classical ciphers like AES, for example. So we have this notion of the avalanche effect, so that we want to be sure that the commands that we do in the encryption or in this kind of hash generation actually have this kind of chaining, so that every change of a single bit, like eventually after several rounds, is going to basically affect every bit, or at least like half of the bits, right? That's usually the standard that we want. So like 50% of the bits should be affected by the single bit change, and not too much, not less, right? Because like we know that 50% means like it's basically like a coin toss. So we have no information content in that sense. If every bit would be flipped, right, that means that we can figure out this stuff. If this is no 0 bits change, that means that there's no influence, there is something wrong with the function. And everything between like 0 and 50% means that there is some kind of non-trivial information contained, and we want to be as close as possible to 50%. And this is actually something that is very subtle, because it is related to a very famous theorem by Claude Shannon, and the notion of information entropy, so that like somehow it's impossible in cryptography to generate strings which are completely random, because we are encoding information. So we want to do back and forth, right? But if we are getting very close to somehow the distribution, so if you look at first a single bit, then pairs of bits and triples of bits, and then you measure the frequency of all of these combinations of bits appearing, then in principle, and that's exactly what Shannon tells us in his famous book from 48 about principles of cryptography, is that if you make any kind of standard or encoding or hash function, something like this, that is very close to 50% in the distribution, then it's very difficult to invert these functions to recover the information. It's not possible to have exactly 50%, because this will mean that we have lost information, right? But in cryptography, the whole game, and also in cryptocurrencies, we want to be sure that we are just pretending to be extremely close to being completely random, so that if anyone wants to steal our information, our data, well, they are going to have hard time, because if something is very close to this 50%, so to this ideal random distribution, that means that they need like exponential amount of compute to actually recover what we have tried to hide, right? So basically it means that if you get really close to this ideal cryptography, the amount of compute to crack anything grows exponentially, at least, right? So that's very good. That's something we we want, right? We want to be safe. So, and being safe actually, in principle, would require like this kind of exponential effort to somehow recover something. But there's a little catch here, because actually this property that the hash function like SHA is one way, so that it's very difficult to undo it. Well, it it was never actually proved, and it's actually extremely hard to show that it has this one-way property, right? It's actually related to a very famous problem in mathematics, which is called the NP versus P conjecture, right? Is the complexity class of the of this non-deterministic polynomial against polynomial is the same or different, and to actually prove that any kind of function like SHA is not easily reversible would require to know some instance of this conjecture, and that was never proved. So we can only say that the currently best algorithms that can crack this kind of stuff, like SHA, like recover, for example, the data, or like even to forge a document which is completely different, but with the same kind of shortcut. So far, we know that in principle, the algorithms that do it are exponential, but it's not guaranteed that they have to be exponential. So we actually don't know, right? So I would say that everything in crypto and in cryptography also depends on this belief that some of these cryptographic primitives that we use are actually unbeatable. But as we know, from the stories on the internet, also about SHA and the development of SHA functions, that this is not always the case.
That was a very illuminating that it is never proven. And that brings us to our next question. In Bitcoin, we use SHA-256, and before that, SHA-1 existed. One of the reasons that I think at the time that Bitcoin was invented, it was in 2008, 2009 when it started working. Depends which point we consider as the starting point. SHA-1 was already broken. And one of my questions is that what do we mean by broken? Was it possible to reverse it, or did it have some other flaws? And what was the reason that SHA-256 was used instead of SHA-1?
So like if you look at the table of progress about the algorithms that can, for example, generate. So let's say that you have one document and you have generated your SHA, and then now you want to figure out a completely different document with some kind of changes that you made on purpose, but to be really close to your original SHA value. Then you can, as I said, then you can, if you just take off-the-shelf algorithms, then the proof of work required even with SHA-1 to succeed. So that means that how many binary operations you have to perform in order to actually achieve this was like 2 to power, I don't remember, like 150, maybe 200. It's like such an amount of computations that it's even hard to comprehend this kind of number. But what happened is that actually, so that was somehow the technical issue with the original SHA, and that's addressing your question. Is that I mean, from the specific form of this protocol, you were able to somehow analyze and hack a little bit more cleverly into the data that was being processed in SHA itself. And the best attacks, that's effectively what people call broken, means that the amount of compute needed to somehow do a different document with the same SHA, so actually achieve the collision, was lowered to the regime of something like 2 to power 30, I guess. And then if you have like a lot of parallel compute, then, like if you have like 10,000 CPUs or GPUs, you can actually use both because it's a very simple operations that you do. Then you just run it for like a few days, maybe a few hours. And then you're going to see that actually you can achieve practically this goal of somehow forging the document and having exactly this collision. Okay, so and this was it also happened several times with classical symmetric cryptography, that that the algorithms were broken in this sense, so that for example, the famous digital encryption standard that was the previous standard for the symmetric cryptography before AES, it was actually broken in the sense that using differential and linear cryptanalysis, people lowered the amount of compute to something that there was actually a custom-made chip for somehow seeking for the right key, and this was actually meant to be practical. So it was like running for like several days, and then it was producing the encryption key just from the analysis of the pairs of encryption and decryption pairs. So this is what we mean by the algorithm being broken. And of course, one has to understand that even if you break this kind of algorithm like SHA-1 practically, I mean, it's still like a lot of compute to actually perform this task. And in many situations when, we use SHA over the internet or like in crypto, I would say the necessity for this algorithm to be secure might span between, like minutes to hours to days. That depends on the actual application. So sometimes even if the algorithm has a practical way of breaking it, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's like broken for every possible application, right? But in cryptography, we try to be super cautious, right? So we have the same issue with RSA, for example, so that if we think about a long time, long horizon, sometimes we have data like ledgers and so on that we want to be sure that no one will be able to tweak with, right? So if you have a practical but maybe still very computational heavy possibility that forging some information is possible, then usually the cryptographic standards are being replaced and enhanced. And what's important is that actually in most cryptographic applications, like this is exactly the case with SHA, we have a way to scale up the algorithm to produce a longer number, right? Maybe with more rounds, maybe with some kind of custom tweaks. That's exactly what happens with SHA-256. But in principle, like we never do too much effort before we discover that there is an obvious way to actually break the actual algorithm that we use, right? So you always try to keep the bar as low as possible, but knowing that there is no practical possibility for this algorithm to be broken. And like you said, it was known already before Bitcoin was invented that these kind of attacks can happen, but somehow it was still so much effort, so much compute that nobody would consider this as, I would say, as like a routine attack, that every possible transaction could be forged, right? That would be catastrophic. But of course, when time goes on and we know that the amount of compute is growing, that the speed of CPUs and GPUs is also going higher. We have the famous Moore's law, so we expect that if something is within weeks, maybe in years' time, it will be possible within days, and then hours, and then minutes, and then seconds. And if something is possible within seconds to break or to forge, well, that's obviously not very secure, right? So we always anticipate the future, like with a horizon for at least like a few years, and that's why some of the algorithms are being discarded immediately from some of the applications like banking. But maybe if the information contained in the algorithm is not so long living, right? We can actually lower our standards, and that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in GitHub they use SHA-1 still. I am not 100% sure, but as you said, applications might determine which one we want to use.
But that's understandable, because in GitHub, you can see that the whole point is that, I mean, you want everyone to encourage other people to use your code, right? You just want to make sure that the changes in the code are not messed up, and then people are really using the right version of the code, right? So you want the simplest possible algorithm that can allow you to somehow, quickly tell the difference between the repos. The repos are so huge, right, that if we want to, encode, interweave all the data from all of the repos, we better want the simplest function possible, right? Not too simple, because if it's really too simple, then the amount of collisions might be so high, right? So then it would be very annoying, because like you could really come with no malicious intent, and somehow, you change something in the docs, and that would be not so bad. But like, if in parallel to changing in the docs, you change, like a data type in the function, and you still get the collision, wow, that's pretty bad, right? Someone downloads your Python library and then say like, oh, hey, look, like this is the right shortcut, so that should work the same, but now I see that the function is working differently, right? So what's going on? So that's why we want something a little bit non-trivial, right? It's actually maybe interesting to think, if you want to get somehow a deeper understanding about this kind of magical functions, like what kind of mathematical functions we can make to somehow generate this kind of effect, like with SHA. Like if you think about the functions, what kind of functions people know, right? Like we can take a square of a number, right? So let's construct, or like let's turn all the data in the single file into an integer, right? And then let's square this integer. Okay, but this is not very practical, because we get something extremely long. So we typically, what we do, we just mod it out by some number. We take the remainder of division, right? Okay, but then you can see that actually this is not such a practical application, because if we take this reminder to be small, which we want to keep, the shortcut, the SHA value, or this SHA value rather short, then we are going to see that, the amount of documents against the sample space in which we are going to land is so big, so that like almost every document is going to give you easily some kind of collision, right? So that means that algebraic functions are not very good for this application. So you can already remove all of the polynomials. Okay, but then you think, okay, what kind of other information, mathematical, idea I can use to make such a function? Then you think, oh, okay, now I can maybe like, take a piece of data and then just shift it, and then do some kind of XORing, some kind of stuff like this. And then you see, okay, this is working, but then you ask yourself like, but then how do I make sure that the amount of collisions is small, right? Because I can experimentally see that it's probably very unlikely to have a collision, because it's very difficult to solve it. And this is not always the case. So that's something that is magical about SHA, is that the steps that you do are actually at the same time kind of messing around with the data, but are not too complicated. So that in the end, you can actually prove that the amount of possible collisions, like if you have a random data, is like the probability that you have two documents, and like in some appropriate distance of Hamming distance, or so on, or Levenstein distance if you want. Also, you can also take the probability of the collision is like like less than 10 to minus n, and n is sufficiently big, right? So this is the usual thinking about these kind of functions. And if you take a random function, which will be the ideal, that's what Shannon will tell us, take a random function. But then this probability of no collision is very hard to compute, right?
Yeah.
So somehow we want something that is like a polynomial, so that we can exactly say for which type of data we are going to expect a collision. But polynomial is too simple, so it's like a trade-off, right? You want to find something that's a typical cryptography thing. You want to find something that is still like a very low bar, but almost looking like a random stuff, and easy to control in the sense that you can make a faithful prediction of how many collisions are going to happen. And if you put all of these constraints, you can see that this opens up an actual research, right? And that's why people were so proud that SHA was invented, because it was one of the first, MD5, also MD4, and so on. But these were the first functions to prove the point where everything was kind of controllable, super easy to compute, but not too easy, right? So that's this magical tension that we have between these conditions.
What did SHA-256 exactly improve in simple terms so that an 18-year-old can understand? And what are the vulnerabilities for SHA-256 right now?
I'm not sure if I can say in simple terms, but definitely, well, one thing that, and this is kind of persistent pattern, is that you increase the number of turns, and also, well, you can see some kind of interesting effect. If you have a particular algorithm which in rounds is just somehow mixing up the data, there is some kind of magical property which is related to this avalanche effect, is that if you do this procedure, like recurrent procedure in rounds, then you can see basically from just looking at the distribution of the bits, is that I would say that the randomness is increasing, but up to some point. So like there is no point of doing more rounds than necessary, because you already get the avalanche effect at some point. So then you stop. And how do I say? So for SHA-256, what was changed was the length of the operating blocks that were used. And of course, then there is a bigger risk that if you are operating on the longer block, then still the avalanche effect will not happen for like a small number of rounds. So then you also increase the number of rounds of this operation. But it's not, if you look at the code, it's not that you just take the original SHA and then you say, okay, let's just add more bits, because that would be too easy. So I think for an 18-year older, I think what would be maybe nice to say is that I think this analogy with polynomials would be quite vital. It's like, if you started with a squaring function, then actually going to function which raises everything to the 4th power, the 6th power, so on. I mean, in principle, it would change a little bit the function itself, but not so much. So somehow we needed a combination of longer blocks and a bit of like tinkering about what goes where in the cycle. It's quite hard to say. I mean, like in my experience, also when I teach cryptography and I get this kind of questions, and then I explain in detail, which I have no intent now to do the algorithm itself, you can see that there is like a lot of cuisine behind the scenes. So like even with AES, it's the same story. It's like you look at the algorithm and then you can ask yourself questions like, oh, why this shift is taken, or like, why do we do exactly this step? And if you look at the general framework, you could see that basically, all of the choices would be good. But then again, you do this kind of deep analysis of the sequence distributions. You test it on different data entries, and then you see that there are several values, or like sometimes you just get this experimentally, this kind of hyperparameters, for which the algorithm is working remarkably well. So like the deeper information content distribution is somehow more ideal for some special choices. I don't know if this is well, I mean, I always think sometimes that there is always a possibility in this case for a backdoor. That's something that everyone should be worried. And that's why it's very good to have white papers in which all of these meta principles are explained. So then if you have like a experimental choice of parameters, like how much you shift, why you sort these bits with these bits, there is some kind of meta principle explained behind this. That's exactly what happened with advanced encryption standard. The white paper, which is called the wild trail strategy, is very meticulously explaining, the authors of the algorithm are explaining why they made these choices, because somehow when you look at the possibility for the avalanche effect, it was like being optimized for certain classes of parameters. So I think maybe it's not so important to know exactly the technicalities behind SHA-256 compared to SHA-1. But one thing to remember is that um, we are always operating on bits which are discrete. So and in general, this is a phenomenon in number theory that if we make choices which are somehow a bit specific, we can make basically any function in number theory, almost any function number theory, to behave in such an erratic way that we can say that this is like a pseudo-random, and that's somehow one of the, I would say, major principles behind it. But it's more like, that's why I mentioned the word cuisine, because it's more art than science, right? I mean, remember these principles that we want to do still fast, so we could not throw away everything about SHA-1 that people knew. But on the other hand, you know that you want to do something sufficiently different so that you're not going to end up in 2 weeks' time with something that is almost the same, right? The same issue. The proof of work will be very low. So then you just, I mean, in general, like for SHA, it's actually quite easy with a little bit of care of these shift registers and so on to build SHA-500, 1000, or whatever number of bits, right? But sometimes you get like magical choices for the bits that mathematically something weird can happen. Like with data encryption standard, the weird thing was that there were actually keys, 56-bit keys, which actually had this issue that they were not coding anything at all. Right, so you send a message
and it gives
exactly, and you can actually do it in Python. It's a nice exercise. I often do it with students to exactly discover for which keys you have this property that they are fixed points of this function, and it's a quirk, right? So now what the inventors thought about this, well, because they knew about this flaw, is that said, okay, but the whole point is that we are going to use a random key, and if there's like about, I don't know, like 8 or 16, don't remember exactly, but there's like a really small number of these keys for which everything is trivial, well, we can always just list them and discard it, right? And for SHA, you can also think that, okay, you're like using it for all possible types of documents, including video, music, and so on. But you can always assume sensibly that in a way, if the algorithm is, like matching up the data from different parts of the document, it actually doesn't matter what the data is, because everything is kind of randomish, right? On this kind of level. So you just want to be sure that your algorithm is not doing in any part anything that is like super predictable, right? That, like you start from the first bit, and then this first bit goes all the way to the end, and it actually shows up in the first bit of your SHA value, right? That would be actually bad. And that's it. So that's, I think, what is the main difference. I mean, without going really into a proper lecture, I mean, we could spend like 60 minutes here talking about like, oh, it goes here, and why there's XOR here, and what's going on? Yeah.
I will definitely dig into the code with those 56 thingies so that they don't change the code at all. I will check them out. And something that is asked a lot, or one of the very big fears or doubts about Bitcoin, is that SHA-256 is proven to be broken with enough advancement in quantum computing. With how imminent in that is that a danger, and what can be done?
Well, I mean, you're probably talking about the Grover's algorithm, but one thing. So I'm also teaching quantum computation, and it's always fun to talk about this because it's a very interesting topic. But one thing to understand about Grover's algorithm is that to make it really efficient, and then in principle maybe a bit dangerous for things like SHA, you have to remember that in Grover, you have to somehow implement a way in which some kind of very specific Boolean circuit is going to operate on this quantum computer. So you need like you can use like something called Toffoli gates to somehow make this part programmable. So then if you actually have a task like you want to break SHA with Grover, you need to implement this dynamical infrastructure on the quantum computer. And for all I know, this is completely impractical. So even if, so assuming you had a way to dynamically program this part and it will be working, then your Grover what will just not completely break stuff. So it's not even changing the exponential time of the known algorithms to polynomial time. It's just cutting the exponent like by half or by third or by something like this. But then, okay, so this is all going to happen provided that your part about Boolean circuitry can be also efficiently implemented. And that's never the case. So we have very foundational problems. So I would say that Grover's algorithm is a super cool thing to know that it exists. But it's one of these many algorithms that are completely impractical to use. So somehow, like first of all, we have now quantum computers that at best might have like about 1,000 physical qubits. But to make the computations, like for example, the quantum Fourier transform, you need to operate with entanglement and entangled qubits. And on physical quantum computers, it's actually not possible to entangle with high fidelity like any pair of qubits. And that's exactly what we were supposed to do. So then on top of the physical qubits, you can invent some kind of correction system like we have also on RAM memory, right? This is called the self-correcting codes that we use on the level of hardware. The same kind of stuff, kind of the same, works on quantum computers. But then the effective logical qubits that you get out of this get divided by a factor of like 100, maybe more. So like if you have 1,000 qubits, you can operate really with 10 qubits. So, and that means that like even SHA-1 was way out of scope even for implementation with Grover. So Grover is like something like in the style of Shannon that tells you that if you have an unlimited amount of resources and some kind of magical way of implementing this Boolean circuitry properly, you could actually lower the exponents of the complexity for finding two different documents with the same shortcut by a factor of half. I think it's not, in any reasonable sense, is not a threat because first of all we have no computers with more than 1,000 qubits
and physical qubits.
Yeah, and like even if some malicious agency would somehow really make a computer with 1 million qubits or more, which might be in some sense combining some risk into SHA. I mean, why would they want to spend all of their money running this computer, because that's expensive?
Yeah.
For breaking SHAs of random people, you have to know that there is some, like, even if you do Bitcoin transaction, I mean, it's very difficult to say, from the traffic, like, is this customer super rich, or like the transaction is very hefty, right? So that's some kind of information that might be not easy to fetch on the go. So I think nobody with super big quantum computers would spend time, I think, on doing this kind of stuff. They could do some other stuff as well, like breaking RSA. I think would be more feasible, because actually RSA just needs really 3,000 logical qubits about to break the RSA 2048. So that would be probably a more risky aspect of using it. But we are so far away from the situation that we can be completely safe. So
even from one logical qubit, I think.
well, one logical qubit just allows you to do a computation with one bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
I mean, that is even not produced. We do not have that.
well,
right?
we can do up to a few logical qubits now. Yeah. So like factorization of numbers like 21 with Shor's algorithm, that's actually possible. Well, you can also, like, you can run Grover. I actually do run Grover with my students on an emulator, but it's like, it's for fun. It's not for anything malicious.
Or
So,
for
yeah.
burning the CPU of that computer.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, if the quantum computers would eventually scale up, we definitely want to have experts in the field, right? So that's why we are teaching the students quantum computations, because, like, with some hope that maybe 10, 20, 30 years time, we will still need these experts to actually operate these quantum computers. But I mean, time will tell. I mean, AI is developing so fast that maybe it will be some AI system that will be just controlling the quantum computer, not us. So we will see.
So from your prediction right now, this considering the state of the things are right now, it requires something like 20 years for us to get to that point.
Well, there is always this kind of a joke that, with this kind of breakthrough technology and somehow so many ideas but completely unstable, like, saying something that is like in 20 years time is probably pretty safe. But that's the same kind of question people ask about nuclear fusion. And I was at a few conferences like 15, 20 years ago, that someone was saying like the nuclear fusion effectively will happen in 20 years time. We're now in 2025, and I still hear the same kind of predictions. Is like a moving horizon. And with quantum computers, to be honest, like, we have not made too much progress since the 1990s, right? So like where the first setups with one qubit were done. Now we are
IBM and all this
now,
stuff.
IBM has amazing infrastructure, and they have this quantum platform which I like using a lot. But even they had to somehow modify their expectancy and perspective. So they were, I think, a little bit too optimistic about how the size of the number of qubits, logical qubits, will scale up. Well, there is also Google, right? Like Google was showing this Wilmore computer. There was some controversy about Microsoft's Majorana one. Nobody still knows whether
More powerful than Willow?
well, it's first of all, it's a completely different source of qubits. I think this is the main difference, and maybe something important to know, that um, on the level of quantum computations, it's like it's like something in which you actually don't need to know anything about quantum mechanics. But to actually make a single qubit, right, this feature that you can entangle and use, you need a physical device with some kind of distinguished Hamiltonian that can, uh, nicely tell the difference between two different states. That's exactly how you get this, like a 0 and 1 state, in a sense. And all of these companies and labs, they have different ideas. There are also light-based computers, and there's also this kind of partial quantum computer called annealing computers. Kubo designs but basically all of these infrastructure have the same problem, that in the end, to make something entangled, there must be some kind of physical connection between these devices. And we live in a 3D world.
Yeah.
Where actually to connect stuff to one place, we are very limited by the size of the plug, right? So that's one of the fundamental issues with quantum computations, is that if you make a box, you just have a very limited space to connect it to another box, right? So somehow, if we lived in like several thousands of dimensions, then we could maybe easier build quantum computers at scale. But still, it's such an interesting and ongoing research that I would not put too much money on the prediction that in 20 years' time we are going to really see high-scale quantum computers. But I might be at the same time completely wrong, because maybe in like 5 years' time, someone will make
breakthrough.
That's like, if you think about the development of classical computers from the 50s to this kind of devices that we have. There was a steady pace of progress, like actually exponential. That's the famous Moore's law. But every single period in which this exponential happened was actually caused by a completely different type of engineering miracle, right? And we are now at the level with these quantum computers, I think around 1950s. That's not an exaggeration, that we are like on the very early days of the infrastructure. What is remarkable is that in the 50s, people didn't have that many algorithms built for classical computers, so it was not something that was widely adopted.
Yes.
And here we have, I would say, quite the opposite situation. We have a lot of theoretical algorithms that could be in principle implemented on quantum computers, and they work. But something that we actually don't know yet is there any algorithm on the quantum computer that would be somehow like practically useful for any kind of purpose, and provably faster, like by complexity class, like here polynomial, and then on classical computers something exponential. So even with Wilmore, what they showed was that there is a algorithm that can actually perform provably faster on the quantum computer against the classical one. But if you look at what this algorithm does, I mean, there's nothing practical about it, right? So
it doesn't break SHA-256.
no. I think there is some kind of deeper meta principle which I like to think about, is that quantum computers are secretly doing an operation which I already mentioned, the Fourier discrete quantum transform. It's like, this is some kind of operation in which you go from the state space to the phase space. And secretly, on the level of bits, is like it allows you to interweave the information from all of the bits into some kind of big package. That's roughly what it does. And if you have an algorithm that can be solved by this kind of approach, which surprisingly was proved by Shor to be actually factorization of integers, then you're on the winning side. But for most algorithms that we know, including SHA, I mean, we have absolutely no idea if they are anyhow connected to quantum Fourier transform or something of this kind. I mean, it's like a very difficult, serious question in theoretical computer science, and I know several people also from our neighboring faculty of physics and astronomy that they are thinking about this, and nobody has any satisfying answer.
That's actually one of the fields that I would like to have a conversation with you about, but I think that will go beyond the time that we have, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I think in sometime in the future we can dedicate some time to talking about quantum computers, because I want to understand them better. Do they kind of sublime the three-dimensional world that we have?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting topic, maybe for another conversation, that's for sure. One thing to remember is that internally, that's why I would definitely encourage the people listening to this podcast, is that like with AI, and the major thing is understanding what is a tensor and matrix, and what operations you can do with these objects. And then you have, this kind of activation function and softmax, and a lot of engineering and data collection and so on. But somehow, like mathematically, also the policy, reinforcement learning, all of this stuff, it's like fundamentally mathematics, which is not extremely hard, right? I mean, like the notions, mathematical notions behind this are very simple. And there's also a very nice analogy that in quantum computations, all of the notions are super simple. Like basically you have matrices, which are unitary, which are like generalized rotations. And then in the end, you have a probability computed from the amplitudes of these states. And that's it. So somehow, conceptually, quantum computations, I would say, are really easy. I mean, they are different for sure than the quantum Boolean circuitry, because in Boolean circuits, you operate on discrete functions, right? So that's somehow, I would say, the realm of logic. While on the quantum computer, you rather apply operators which can have complex coefficients. So it's maybe the most difficult thing about quantum computation is that some of the operators have absolutely no analog in the classical world. Like, for example, the function not. You can make a matrix, 2x2 matrix, which has the property that if you compose it twice, you get the not operator, right? You just have the flip. And so that means that on the quantum computer, you can implement a gate, which is a square root of negation. What does it mean, like logically, right? Means nothing. But the point is that if you get used to this kind of weird operators, sometimes you can do some useful stuff, like in very much parallel style, right? So that you get information just by accumulating these kind of weird operators. But like internally, it's just linear algebra and a little bit of probability. So that's why I encourage people to take a look. Also, like IBM has a very nice platform, but there is also a very nice programming language called a Classic, and there's Qiskit. And there are like people like in the Q World organization that organize this kind of workshops, and they give people some kind of learning material. So it's not very difficult to get into quantum computations, but just beware that just be warned that it's definitely not a topic on which you can earn a lot of money. I think definitely the mathematics behind it might be useful for some business projects in which you really make money. But so far, the quantum computations are really a huge, I would say, scientific experiment. And we have no idea if they are going to become really practically useful.
Okay, thank you, Bartosz, for all your
Thank you very
vivid
much.
explanations. And it was interesting to understand that, to learn that Grover is not the only algorithm, but it is very improbable to implement. And there are some other algorithms that are there. So there were so many things, so many takeaways from this talk. Hope to see you again and have more
Thank you,
conversations.
Pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and give the video a like. It really helps. If you're tuning in on a podcast app, I'd love it if you could leave a review, especially on Apple Podcasts. It goes a long way in helping more people find the show. You can also support me by listening on Podcasting 2.0 apps like Fountain or Breeze, and streaming me some sats while you listen. Feel free to zap me and follow me on Nostr too. If you'd like to send a Lightning donation, just scan the QR code or visit my Linktree. The link is in the description. You'll find more ways to support or follow my work there.